Hello and welcome everyone to the fourth seminar of Permafrost seminar series for the year. Today, Tabatha Rahman will be presenting Ice-Wedge volume distribution and development in the Barrens of the Hudson Bay Lowlands, northern Manitoba. Tabatha is a PhD candidate at the Permafrost Research Laboratory at Université Laval under the supervision of Dr. Pascal. Their lab focuses on geocryology and permafrost geomorphology, with many field-based interdisciplinary projects and collaborations. Tabatha conducted her undergraduate thesis on the continuous permafrost of Excel Hybrid Island, high in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Her research migrated southwards for her master's when she studied the continuous permafrost of Melville Island, Nunavut. She's now working on some of the Canada's southernmost continuous permafrost in the Hudson Bay lowlands of northern Manitoba. Specifically, she's interested in ice-wedge characterization and elucidating the relationships between wedge ice development and landscape evolution. So now I would hand over the stage to Tabatha for her presentation.
So hi everyone, thank you so much for being here today and for your interest in this topic. Like Usman mentioned, I'll be presenting a PermafrostNet Theme 1 project on ice-wedge development in the Barrens of the Hudson Bay Lowlands in northern Manitoba. This is a project I'm working on as part of my PhD with my amazing supervisor, Pascal Roy-Léveillé. So in last week's seminar, Gabriel Peram spoke about the effects of environmental controls on epigenetic ice wedge cracking using a modeling approach. Today, I'll also be speaking about ice wedge development, although I have opted to investigate this through a field-based geomorphological approach. I'd like to start off by acknowledging my position as a settler in Canada and expressing my gratitude for being able to share and learn from the lands traditionally used by the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, Innu, Atskamek, and Malisite nations, as well as the Treaty 5 territory of northern Manitoba, traditionally used by the Cree, Dene, Red River Métis, and Inuit. So ice wedges are often referred to as the most common type of ground ice. We can find them as high as in the polar desert of the Canadian High Arctic, as low as in the subarctic, as well as many places in between, including here in Old Crow Flats, on Banks Island, on Violet Island, and near Salouet. Of course, ice wedges across these regions have very different volumes and morphologies as a result of variability in climate, water availability, substrate composition and texture, topography, vegetation, quaternary history, and more. One very large region where wedge ice has not yet been investigated is the Hudson Bay Lowlands, located in northern Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. The Hudson Bay Lowlands are Canada's largest permafrost peatland, with peat thickness reaching up to 4 meters in some areas. My PhD focuses on ice wedges in the northwestern corner of the Hudson Bay Lowlands in a region called the Barrens. There currently exists no field-based knowledge of ice wedges in this area. But what we do know is that satellite imagery indicates extensive polygonal terrain throughout the Barrens' 14,100 square kilometer surface, and that the recent ground ice map of Canada, which used a paleogeographic approach to model ice wedge abundance across the country, modeled negligible ice wedge for the Barrens. According to this study, the Barrens are expected to have small ice wedges located in organic terrain exclusively. But because there doesn't exist field-based investigations of ice wedges in the region, we don't really know how much wedge ice there actually is in the Barrens, or when it developed, and under what conditions. A better understanding of ice wedges in the Barrens is required not only to improve conceptual knowledge of wedge ice development in this uplifted permafrost peatland, but also to improve models of biogeochemical cycling, to mitigate the risks associated with permafrost thaw on Canada's largest polar bear denning habitat, and to predict and mitigate the risks associated with landscape transformation along the Hudson Bay Railway, our country's only permafrost railway. Today, I'll be presenting results on ice wedge volume, as well as preliminary results on the conditions and timing of ice wedge development in the region. To provide a bit of context, the Hudson Bay Lowlands contain Canada's southernmost continuous permafrost, are characterized by a low relief, a thick organic substrate, and wetland landforms. This vast lowland was inundated by the post-glacial tidal sea, known as the Hudson Bay, from which it has gradually emerged for the past 8,000 years due to glacial-isostatic uplift. This indicates that the permafrost within the Hudson Bay lowlands formed within the Holocene. The Barrens are a 14,100 square kilometer zone located at 58 degrees north and approximately 75 kilometers south of Churchill, Manitoba. The region falls within the taiga tundra ecotone, but contains very limited tree cover. It is characterized by a subarctic climate transitioning into a boreal climate further inland. The Barrens have been able to maintain continuous permafrost because of a mean annual air temperature of minus 6.5 degrees Celsius, a thick peat cover, as well as low snow accumulation. The Barrens have been discussed and even mapped in the literature before, although they were never given a name. In my work, I delineated the Barrens as the region of polygonal peat plateaus south of Churchill with a low tree cover. Although polygonal peat plateaus are characteristic of the Barrens, this region contains a patchwork of different terrain units, including many lakes and ponds, fens, shrub tundra, and a few others. My first objective was to determine the volume of ice wedges in the Barrens. To do so, I had to determine the cross-section area of a few ice wedges and determine the length of the ice wedge troughs. Several methods for determining ice wedge cross-section area were attempted. Because no one had studied ice wedges here before, there was no go-to method for this type of investigation. So we first looked for ice wedge exposures along river and lake banks, but were unfortunately unsuccessful. We then tried to locate wedge ice by drilling into ice wedge troughs and looking at the material stuck on the drill bit at various depths. But this method was imprecise and did not allow me to differentiate between different types of ice. So we were unsuccessful. Then we tried a method recommended by Samuel Gagnon of thawing the ice from the top down, but that got messy very quickly as the trench kept flooding. Even after draining the trenches, only parts of the ice wedge surface were visible, and this did not allow me to determine cross-section area. So we then opted to extract permafrost cores from ice wedge troughs using a portable drill, which allowed for a better view of the cryostratigraphy. At first, we tried collecting 2-inch permafrost cores, but the ice shattered upon drilling, which prevented me from differentiating between different types of ground ice. We then tried extracting 4-inch permafrost cores using a different drill, which worked very well because it kept the cryostructures intact. Success. For my research, it was crucial that the ice remained as intact as possible and retained its original shape, color, cracks, bubbles, and cryostructures, as these are all used to distinguish between different types of ground ice and to elucidate thermomechanical processes in the permafrost. As you can see here, the unaided eye can identify differences in ground ice characteristics. For example, we see pool ice here in green that can be distinguished due to its transparency and lack of foliation, whereas wedge ice here in orange is opaque and much more foliated, especially on the core to the right. Permafrost cores were collected in late August and early September when the frost table was nearing its maximum depth. Ice wedge geometry and vertical distribution were assessed from permafrost cores extracted from 57 boreholes across 14 distinct ice wedges. Most of the cores were taken along short transects perpendicular to ice wedge troughs. Boreholes ranged between 1 and 3 meters in depth because the base of Ice-Wedge was usually encountered above 2.5 meter depth. As you can see by the yellow dots on the map, most boreholes were placed along a 98-kilometer latitudinal transect following the Hudson Bay Railway, which also corresponds to the direction of the Tyrol Sea retreat, and therefore to the direction of the peat thickness gradient. A few additional boreholes were placed in the eastern half of the Barrens within Wapusk National Park. I first identified wedge ice visually based on its foliation, color, and placement. I then CT scanned all my cores to help with cryostructure identification. In this example, the core cut through the side of a wedge, enabling me to locate the exterior boundary of the wedge. When I was still unable to confidently distinguish between ground ice types, I used stable water isotope analyses. I flew to Dwayne Fraze's PAX lab in Edmonton, where I analyzed 83 ground ice samples. Because wedge ice forms in the spring, whereas pool ice and pore ice form in the fall, the isotopic signatures of wedge ice is different from that of pool or pore ice. I therefore determined the typical range of isotopic signatures for samples of known wedge ice, pool ice, and pore ice. Then I was able to match the isotopic signature of unknown samples to these known ice types. Pulling all this together, I was able to determine the location of wedge ice within these core assemblages. On this figure, we can see 6 ice wedges in which I collected cores across the troughs. The brown represents organic soil, the darker gray represents mineral soil, the white represents wedge ice, and the blue represents pool ice. The light gray is where I don't have any data. I then interpolated between boreholes to get an idea of what the wedges may look like, and this is the result. You might be surprised to see these types of morphologies, and I'll discuss them a bit later. But for now, these results allowed me to calculate cross-section area and a mean cross-section area of 1.2 meters squared. The range and the standard deviations are quite high, which is why I've opted to provide a range of ice wedge volumes for the Barrens instead of a single value. After having determined the cross-section area for 6 wedges across the Barrens, I moved on to calculating the length of troughs. I identified 30 randomly distributed sites from satellite imagery in which I will manually trace ice wedge troughs. But today, I'll only be presenting results from 5 of these sites. Within each site, I mapped the terrain units and traced the ice wedge troughs, which allowed me to determine the distribution of ice wedges within each terrain unit. I calculated a mean ice wedge density of 0.021 meters of ice wedge trough per square kilometer of land, all terrain units considered. But when only considering the polygonal terrain, the ice wedge density went up to 0.041 meters per square kilometer of land, which is just a bit higher than what was calculated for the outer Mackenzie Delta. Overall, there's an estimated 290 million meters of ice wedge troughs in the Barrens. With the help of my colleagues, I was able to obtain a few drone surveys with better resolution than the satellite imagery I used to trace the ice wedge troughs. I then traced ice wedge troughs on the drone imagery to determine how many smaller ice wedge troughs and cracks I had missed simply because of the coarse resolution of the sat imagery. Like, for example, this crack right here. Results indicate that drone imagery can capture between 22 and 37% more ice wedges than the satellite imagery that I used. This scales up to between 64 million and 110 million meters of ice wedge troughs in the Barrens that cannot be seen nor traced on coarser resolution satellite imagery. To calculate the total volume of ice wedges in the Barrens, I multiplied the cross-section area of smaller ice wedges to the length of the smaller troughs from drone imagery, and I added this to the cross-section area of larger ice wedges multiplied by the length of larger troughs seen on satellite imagery. Considering there's a range in the length of small troughs on drone imagery, the ice wedge volume ranges between 0.30 and 0.38 cubic kilometers for the Barrens, equivalent to 0.86 to 1.1% of the upper 2.5 meters of ground that's composed of wedge ice. In the near future, I'll be adjusting this value to better represent the range of ice wedge cross-section area that I measured. We might be tempted to compare these results to other studies where percentages are also expressed, such as in the Fosheim Peninsula, Tombstone National Park, and in the Mackenzie Delta. However, these values are always given for a particular depth, and since these depths vary between studies, they are difficult to compare between studies. For example, the 8 to 22% ice wedge measured in Tombstone Territorial Park is for polygonal tundra only, whereas my values are for the entire landscape and not uniquely for polygonal terrain. So what do these results actually mean for the Barrens? My results may seem small, but ice wedges play a very important role in this landscape. First of all, they influence hydrology by storing up to 0.38 cubic kilometers of ice in the subsurface. Their troughs act as preferential flow pathways, as well as points of thaw initiation. Degraded wedges can accumulate considerably more snow in the winter, thereby influencing the ground's thermal regime. Ice wedges can even prevent the spread of tundra fires, as you can see on this picture of an old burn. There are many other ways in which ice wedges influence landscape evolution in the Barrens, and I'll investigate this further in my third chapter of my PhD. But for now, I'm interested in the development of this ice, which brings me to my second objective: elucidating the timing and conditions associated with ice wedge development and degradation. So we know that the Barrens look like this today, and we know that they looked like this 8,000 years ago. But when and how did ice wedges develop? To answer this question, we must first assess the current state of ice wedges. The current stage of ice wedge development or degradation can be seen through polygonal morphology. Between 2021 and 2023, a mosaic of polygons in different stages of development were observed in the Barrens. In the growth phase, there were incipient polygons, many low-centered polygons, as well as many intermediate-centered polygons, otherwise known as flat-centered polygons. Recent ice wedge aggradation was also observed in nearly all sites through the presence of ice veins at the top of permafrost and cracks into the base of the active layer. While there was ongoing ice wedge aggradation in the Barrens, there was also signs of ice wedge degradation in the region. In the thermokarst space, I noticed high-centered polygons, as you can see here. Several wedges showed clear signs of degradation. Many ice wedge troughs were flooded, while others had completely caved in. Now that we've reviewed the current state of ice wedges in the Barrens, we can dive into the past. I first needed to determine the timing of landscape emergence from the Tyrrell Sea, because we know that permafrost and ice wedges cannot form underwater. Studies have shown that the Barrens were fully inundated by the Tyrrell Sea 8,000 years ago, and that the land has been gradually emerging and uplifting since then. To estimate the timing of land emergence at different sites across the Barrens, I radiocarbon dated basal peat samples. Assuming that peat would have started to accumulate a few hundred years after subaerial exposure, the date of this peat represents an approximate maximum for permafrost and ice wedge aggradation. To obtain basal peat, we retrieved permafrost cores from 5 different 5-meter boreholes from sites across the Barrens. Boreholes were placed in polygon centers to limit the potential for cryoturbation near ice wedges. Peat at the organic mineral boundary was first identified, as shown here in red. The material was then thawed, sieved, and analyzed for macrofossils. Viable plant material was then sent to radiochronology lab where it was AMS radiocarbon dated. Results were not surprising. They showed the oldest dates in the south and the youngest dates in the north. This means that the southern sites had more time to accumulate peat, and assuming comparable rates of peat accumulation, southern sites should have thicker peat than in the north. Well, this is indeed what I observed. By placing the wedges in latitudinal order and along the direction of the Tyrol Sea retreat, I observed thickening peat cover towards the south. I also observed that the two northernmost ice wedges were exclusively located in mineral soil, while the more southern sites were partially located in mineral soil and partially in organic soil. What I did not observe, however, is a latitudinal trend in wedge volume or shape. I thought that maybe the southern sites would have had larger ice wedges because they had more time to form, which brings me to my next question. When did the ice wedges develop in the Barrens? Luckily, there exists a method for dating ice wedges. Some have opted to radiocarbon date particulate organic carbon or macrofossils enclosed in the ice wedges. However, this method can overestimate the age of ice wedges because the inclusions can be quite old. Dating dissolved organic matter, on the other hand, avoids this overestimation because DOC in wedge ice is usually contemporary with the ice veins. This is because snowmelt and surface waters come into contact with surface organics only before freezing into the wedge ice. But when I decided to use this method, I was faced with a dilemma. I wanted to date the oldest ice to determine when the ice wedges started forming, but I did not know where to sample to find the oldest ice. For epigenetic ice wedges, we can assume the oldest ice is near the exterior. For syngenetic ice wedges, we can assume the oldest ice is at the bottom. But for ice wedges like the ones I had, it was hard to tell where the oldest ice might be. So I opted to collect samples at the bottom extremities to increase my chances of collecting relatively old ice. I cut, melted, and filtered the samples and sent them to the Laval radiocarbon lab where they were AMS radiocarbon dated. Results indicate that the ice wedges formed in the past 900 years, mostly during the Little Ice Age. Interestingly, the oldest date was 861 calibrated years before present and was from one of the youngest sites. On the other hand, the youngest ice wedge was 80 calibrated years before present, but was from one of the oldest sites. So there is no trend between time since emergence and ice wedge age, which suggests that ice wedges did not form syngenetically for the first few thousand years of peat aggradation. Cryostratigraphy can give us a hint about the formation of these wedges. As you can see, some of these don't resemble the classic epigenetic, syngenetic, or anti-syngenetic ice wedges described by Mackay. Of course, the sampling method I used did not allow for a complete view of the morphologies, but the results still clearly show 3 double-tailed ice wedges. I used CT scans of all the cores to elucidate the direction and orientation of ice wedge cracking. In black, you can see air bubbles and trains of air bubbles from individual ice veins within the wedge ice. Using this particular wedge ice as an example, I started by identifying the different ground materials, where yellow is mineral soil and green is wedge ice. I then traced the different veins of ice and found that many of the foliations were near horizontal. This is quite unexpected, considering ice wedges crack near vertically. However, the position, color, and isotopic composition confirm this is in fact ice wedges. Overall, cryostratigraphical analyses indicate that the wedges formed within each other, as shown here. The closest morphology I could find to this in the literature was in a paper published by Daniel Fortier and Michel Allard on late Holocene syngenetic ice wedge polygon development on Violet Island. They noted that sedimentation led to an increase of third and fourth order contraction cracks right next to the original wedges. In the Barrens, I've yet to determine what led to the change in cracking directions for my ice wedges, but there are definite signs of past changes to the ground thermal regime. In the first two examples here, we can see that the top of the ice wedge has melted and has refrozen as pool ice or aggradation ice, incorporating lots of organics during the freezing process. Next, we see the shape of the upper and outer edge of an ice wedge, but the ice is much clearer than wedge ice. I interpret this as an ice wedge melting and pool ice refreezing in its place. I hypothesized that fires and changes to the climate likely played an important role in the variations in soil stress fields and ground thermal regimes in the Barrens. There are many signs of past fires across the Barrens, from vast zones with burnt vegetation to charcoal buried in the active layer. There's also evidence that the vegetation cover has varied considerably since land emergence. Large woody material in our permafrost cores from all sites across the Barrens indicate this region was once much more forested than it is today. However, I'll leave the paleo reconstruction to Tina Kolari, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Quebec in Montreal. So to conclude, ice wedge polygons are a characteristic feature of the Barrens. Their density is comparable to that of the outer Mackenzie Delta, and ice wedges represent 0.86 to 1.1% at the upper 2.5 meters of the ground. Ice wedges developed in the past 900 years, which is several thousands of years after the emergence of the land surface from the Tyrol Sea. The double-tailed morphology of ice wedges indicate there was likely a considerable change in the thermal stress field of the soil after the first order wedges developed. In fact, pool and aggradation ice indicate fluctuations in the active layer depth. Currently, some ice wedges are still developing, while others are currently experiencing melt, which is why there's a mosaic of polygons at different stages of development and degradation across the Barrens. I'm eternally grateful to all these people for helping me through the different stages of this project, whether it was working through ideas and hypotheses or helping me collect data in the field and assisting me with lab work. But I'm particularly thankful for Pascal and Emmanuel, who go above and beyond. Lastly, I'd like to thank the funding organizations who made this project possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tabatha. It was a very nice and very thorough presentation. And yeah, I would open the house for questions. So if anybody has any questions, you guys are most welcome.
What a great presentation.
Hi.
I had many questions all the way through, and every time I had a question, like 30 seconds later, you answered it. So really a great talk. Very interesting. Many thoughts in my mind. But the principal one is, let's come back to why they're so young. Because this means that for 5,000 years or longer, you've got peat present, it's growing, you've got permafrost present, and yet there's no ice wedge cracking. Okay, I'm going to ask you a nasty question, which is, do you believe your results? Do you believe that the DOC is the way to go, and therefore dating it is an accurate way of deciding that there was no cracking, at least in the ice wedges you sampled, until 1,000 years ago?
Well, okay, so I did have 11 samples, DOC samples, so it's not like I only had 3 and I was basing my whole interpretation on 3. I realized 11 is not that much, but they were spatially distributed. So, okay, I'm gonna put that there. And then I also want to say that I know that the tree line was 300 kilometers further north. I don't remember exactly when, but after emergence. So during the mid-Holocene, perhaps, mid to late Holocene. So, and we see evidence of that in the cores. We see tree matter. So I don't believe that ice wedges would have cracked when there was a forest present, because we see all around the Barrens there are forest, and the snow cover is so thick there. So there's no way, we can reach the temperatures required for thermal contraction cracking. So to answer your question, yes, I think it's possible they only started cracking like 1,000 years ago. But I haven't.
So it's due to this fundamental change between a forested ecosystem and a tundra ecosystem that should show up in many other ways. I would think it would show up in the peat development and many other things if that's the case. Not many other paleoecological indicators. So coming back to the same, just pursuing this a little further. So of the dated samples, how many came from, was there a difference between the dates you got for primary ice wedges and secondary ice wedges, if you were to group them?
I haven't looked at it. The only one I can think of is the really, really small one, which is very recent, 80 calibrated years before present. And that's like a primary. Well, when you say primary, you mean that they formed first, or you mean that they have a classic shape?
No, I mean when you look at the morphology of the polygons, and you described it as well, you have big troughs, wedges that outline large areas, and then often you have smaller troughs that are going across those wedges, which I would regard as secondary or maybe even tertiary cracks. The primary cracks being the big ones, and presumably they're underlain by the biggest wedges. So if those are the biggest, they're the ones that happened first. So, and logically, in a given area, they're the ones that should give you the oldest for the ice at the bottom, and the more recent ones, like the 80 years one, seems very young, but okay, should give you the youngest age. So I think it could be good anyway to look at that if you haven't looked at it in any detail, but you may not have the samples. Even as you say, 11 or 13 samples is already a lot, but that could also tell you, again, does it make sense with regard to this history of no cracking for the first 6,000 years and then all the cracking in the last 1,000?
Yeah, and I hope to I'm going to pick maybe 1 or 2 wedges and do a finer resolution sampling and dating to see what the variability of ages are within those particular ice wedges. So hopefully I'll be able to answer your question better next time.
Okay, thanks, Tabatha. Really great talk again. Very, very interesting, and lots of wonderful pictures, but also great techniques that you were using to try and answer these very difficult questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yes, Stefan.
Thank you, Tabatha, for this great talk. Similar to Tony, I made some notes, and then usually, I crossed out my notes briefly. So I'm wondering, you've said, further south, they didn't form until then. So implying that there were thousands of years without, ice wedge cracking. I'm wondering, is there a chance that you actually didn't sample the ice from past ice wedges? And I'm just putting 2 scenarios to you as a question. So the one could be, could they have been obliterated to their entire depth by a combination of forest and forest fire? Or could it be that you had a generation of ice wedges in those more southern areas that then became inactivated? Maybe you had a forest or like some further evolution of your peatlands. And then a new generation of ice wedges is the one that you've measured now, but it didn't crack at the same places. So had you sampled not across the modern wedges, but at some other place, would you have found older wedges? Can you speak to any of those possibilities?
Yeah, so definitely the sampling is a limitation because I only have so much time and resources. I did like the wedge that I sampled in the southern region was quite deep. So I don't believe there could have been ice wedges that were completely destroyed, because I don't believe the active layer could have deepened that much, because there is evidence of thaw inconformities, but it's much, much higher than the base of the ice wedge and much higher than where we stopped drilling. So yeah, I'm 100% sure if I sampled another wedge, it would have given me a different date. But what's interesting is just looking at the trend in all the 11 samples. They're all younger than 900 years, calibrated years before present. Yeah. Can you repeat?
But could it be that after the thawing event, you know, the new kind of generation of ice wedge cracking is no longer aligned with the old wedges, right? So if you had done your sampling line across the wedge a lot longer, would you have intersected other inactive wedges that are no longer visible today?
Oh.
Right? Does the new generation of ice wedges, when you have a cooling again, does it necessarily follow the old patterns? Or could those be hidden 2 meters to the side from where you've sampled?
Well, we have GPR data, so we can look at to see if there's ice, but the GPR data could hardly find the ice wedge itself when we knew there was an ice wedge. So I doubt it's going to be able to find relict ice wedges without. Yeah, maybe there's casts of old ice wedges, but honestly, from the literature that I've read, I don't think ice wedges would have formed right after emergence. So they would have formed, in the late Holocene. I'll think about it. I'll think about it some more. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, Steve?
Hi. I'm not gonna. This is amazing. I love it. It's just a super presentation. It's so interesting. I don't have a lot of time. I have to go in a moment. I just want to reiterate to provide some of my own experiences working on the Canadian prairies on sand dunes. When I went out to the prairies and to sample stabilized sand dunes across the Canadian prairies, thinking I was going to look at mid-Holocene, droughts and so forth, and came back and discovered that most of my sand dunes that were stabilized were only maybe 200 years old.
Oh.
And after considerable amount of research in that area, I finally came to the conclusion that these dunes had been reactivated during the Little Ice Age, during a cold, dry period. And there's so many similarities between these studies and what Stefan was saying as well. Because when you go out to sample the obvious, then in the context of, like he's saying, you were looking at ice wedges that were indeed active. And I think you're probably quite correct that this activity is due to the Little Ice Age. Then and it's probably not going to be within the scope of your own study. But then we do have to start to think about, well, what is it that we can't see? And again, when I went back to the prairies, I had to auger and sample places that no longer had this obvious geomorphology in order to ascertain and understand it. Yes, indeed, there was reactivation in the past, but that reactivation had then become hidden, absorbed by what had happened more recently. And there's a lot of parallels. And also want to make the point that perhaps the little ice age event that you're seeing here that's also linked to the prairies may have had quite a significant role on the Canadian landscape in the past that we didn't realize. So it's a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for your comment. When I drilled the transects, they were quite large. They were 3 to 4 meters wide. So I didn't really only drill in the Ice-Wedge trough. I really went outside of the trough into the ridge. And we did drill in the polygon centers, but yeah, didn't find anything that looked like wedge ice outside of near the trough. I guess a future PhD student out there, if they want to do finer resolution drilling, yeah, that would be interesting. Because I just don't know how you would decide on your sampling scheme to just try to find something that you can't see from the surface, maybe geophysics. Yeah.
Tabatha, we can see you thinking on the fly because, and I think that's right, because this is a very, an almost impossible question. You've shown that the area of the troughs is small relative to the area as a whole. So you would need to randomly sample 100 times, and maybe you'll hit one. If there are some hidden ice wedges with the same kind of spacing of the network, same kind of spacing, it's 100 to 1 chance that a single hole is going to hit an ice wedge that's randomly somewhere in that landscape. But I do think that what's been suggested is really interesting. And of course, you just don't have the sections that happen at coasts, let's say on the Beaufort Sea coast. But generally, when we see ice wedges of different ages, they're not in the same place. And that means that, yours could be completely at variance with what's happening deeper. And I think Steve's point that this is maybe a little ice age signal is a really good one. Anyway, but you thought very well on your feet, but I don't think that there's an answer. I don't think anybody could give you an answer as to how to find it. Geophysics would be great, as you say. GPR has potential, but if it can't see deep enough, if you can't see down 3 or 4 meters and you start to see the reflections that you get from ice wedges, I certainly don't have an answer how you would do it, except get a very, very strong undergraduate assistant who doesn't mind drilling holes day after day after day.
Yeah, and Teddy tried a fine resolution ERT over a ice wedge, and then, well, that was to characterize a morphology, but it didn't work for morphology.
Nope. It's great to see your talk and so many field work you did. It's quite amazing. I just wonder, because the age is so young, is it possible based on the deposit of the wood and the materials to see when the peat plateau forms? So based on this, you may have get an understanding probably before it forms a polygon, it may be a fan, or usually they said cyclical changes from time to time that may influence its age. So if you can somehow determine this, it's not a long-term bog. It's probably before or even just recent several hundred years becomes a bog. So if you can determine its changes of ecosystem types, that may give some answers.
Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is like paleo reconstruction of the vegetation. And Peter Curie, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name properly, published in the 1980s a paper on paleo reconstruction, and he found that some of the the peat plateaus were fairly new to the area a bit south of the Barrens. And now there's a new student at UQAM, University of Quebec in Montreal, who's going to be kind of using new technology to address the same issue, and she wants to do paleo reconstruction of Wapask National Park. So yeah, she might be in contact with you. We definitely talked about you in our last meeting. But yeah, I'm gonna date the tree material that I found to see when the forest was active, but I just don't want to go too deep into paleo reconstruction because I want to focus on geomorphology and cryostratigraphy, things like that.
It's good, very nice work. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Tabatha, for a very, very nice presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.